call from.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Very excited. We're starting a new series today. It's a 7-part series. I think officially it's called Bridging the Gap. But the idea behind that, and it took me some time to prepare that, trying to understand why good people do bad things. I'm not talking about bad people. Forget about bad people. But good people, normal people, sometimes do bad things. We all do that. Question is, why? What are the mechanisms? What is it that causes us to do those things? And I think that if we are able to identify those mechanisms, then we can make this world a better place. Right? And we just got back from vacation last week, and my kids were watching cartoons. My younger kids still watch cartoons. And cartoons, in cartoons, it's very clear. There's a very clear distinction between the bad guys and the good guys. Because the good guys are really good, and the bad guys are really bad. By the way, some of the cartoons that I'm thinking, like, when I was a kid, we were talking about it the other day, and I went on YouTube and I found like Popeye. Remember that? Popeye. So I watched it when I was a kid, right? And I'm looking at that, like I'm showing it to my kids, and I said, oh my God, you can't show that to kids anymore today. It's totally politically incorrect. And like, like, what's the story with Olive? I mean, she's with Popeye or she's with Pluto. She's his girlfriend, but she walks on, like, what is it? Like stuff like today, we wouldn't even, smacking people right and left. Today, it's a different world. Anyway, I'm digressing. But generally speaking, in cartoons, the good guys are really good and the bad guys are really bad. Yes. See, well, you're here to learn about it, so that's already good. But the world is much more complex. Our world is much more complex. It's not about black and white. That might work for cartoons, but it doesn't work in the real world. And we all want to fix the world. We want to make it tikkun. We all want to make it a better place. And in order to do that, you say, okay, I need to fight evil. I need to fight the bad guys. And it's easy to think that if I'm going to fight corruption and the bad guys and the evil and what is not moral, etc., that's not simple. That's not easy. And sometimes it's the bad guys that win. So I was going in a different way. In order to a little bit minimize evil in the world, perhaps we need to understand not what's going on in the mind of bad people, but perhaps to understand what is happening in the mind of good people. Therefore, the question is, why good people do bad things? I'll give you just a tiny current example. We're dealing with anti-Semitism today. We're dealing with all those protests, all that kind of stuff. Yes, there are some bad guys. Okay, the Hamas are definitely the bad guys. It's very clear. But what about all those thousands of people, tens of thousands of people that are just ignorant? People who rally, people who go and protest, people who are online being noisy. They're not necessarily bad. They're informed, they're they have misinformation, maybe they hang with the wrong people, all sorts of stuff. Yet they're doing very bad stuff. Now, that question was asked a lot after the Holocaust. How is this possible? There's such huge population was helping, partnering with pure evil, with those who caused the greatest tragedy in the history of the Jewish people. How is this possible that so few actually stood up against evil? And many psychologists and scientists try to deal with that question, to grapple with that question after the Holocaust. Research and studies by people like, of course, I don't have it here. Give me a second. Solomon Asch, for example. Wrote in the 50s a very famous experiment about confirming with social pressure. Basically, to narrow it down, he says that social pressure can impact one's beliefs and behavior, even though if it's clear to that person that the group is wrong. Okay, so he wrote a lot about that stuff. Others, like for example, Philip Zimbardo, who had a bunch of experiments. Very interesting guy, was a professor at Stanford University. To make a long story short, he had a very famous experiment. It's called Prison Superintendent, that basically he took two groups of people. Some of them were prisoners and the others were wardens. And through that experiment, he was able to show that people abuse the power and they're doing horrible things and abuse the prisoners that were not really prisoners, even though it was just a play role. Okay, and he published that and made a lot of it made a lot of noise. Other stuff we can talk about all those stuff later on, but or Stanley Milgram, for example, that was trying to understand what makes people agree to do horrible things that are actually against their nature or against their beliefs. There was this, for example, a very famous experiment, probably know about that there was a group of people and they showed them lines, and the lines were the same length. Yet the group was told in advance to say that no, one of the lines is longer than the others. And there was one person who didn't know what's going on, and he's looking at all the lines are equal, but everybody said, no, one line is longer. And finally, even though he really in his heart he knew that the lines were all the same length, he said, no, one of them is longer, because that was pressure, social pressure, right? So all those experiments, but all those studies showed how to perhaps convert or change a person from being good to being bad, or to do the wrong thing, or to say the wrong thing, or to follow the crowd and that kind of stuff. Okay, everybody had a concept. What is the bad? What is bad? Okay, lying, abusing, whatever that is, right? And how are we going to get a person to follow that, to do that also? Fine. Our question is not why individuals are carried or follow bad guys, but rather why good people do bad things. It's a little bit different. Not why they follow the masses who are doing the bad things, but where is the failure? Where is the mechanism that says, okay, I know it's wrong, but it's okay to do that? Or they're not paying attention or not really understanding that what they do is bad. Okay? Let's delve into that. So this is our series is going to identify 7 of those mechanisms. And hopefully, by identifying those mechanisms, we're going to learn, first of all, more about ourselves. Secondly, about the people around us. And if we do that, perhaps we have a chance of creating a little bit of a tikkun in this world. So the first mechanism I want to talk about is this confusion. Don't worry, we're going to go into the Torah. Don't worry. This confusion between desire and consent. Consent and desire. Okay, there's a confusion. People try to often mix the two. It's not the same. Sometimes people do horrible things of taking advantage, harming others, and the excuse that they give themselves is, well, the victim, well, they agreed. It's good for them. It's actually, I'm helping them. I'm not really doing a bad thing. Okay? Think about abusing of power. You wanted that promotion. I'm doing them a favor. Without me, they're not going to be able to get to where they want. Right? Okay. So we understand what we're talking about. People who are working under horrible conditions of hunger, underpaid, prostitution. Those people are somebody's taking advantage of them. And sometimes the people who are taking advantage of them are not bad people. They're just people that convince themselves that that other person, the victim, actually agreed to that. Actually, they asked for it. I'm doing them a favor. Let's go right into the Torah and see what the Torah talks about. The beginning of Sefer Shmot, we just read that a couple of weeks ago. Bnei Israel, the Jews, are slaves in Egypt. They're slaves in Egypt, hundreds of years of slavery. And it's easy to look at the Egyptians and say, they're the bad guys. We're the slaves. They take advantage of us. Right? They're evil, we're good. But the Torah tells us a story, there's a narrative that is much more complex. On one hand, they're being punished, right? The 10 plagues, the whole thing, whatever, shalach et ami, okay, we know the story. On the other hand, when you read Sefer Dvarim, the Torah is very clear, lo tetaev mitzri. You cannot hate the Egyptians. And also the Torah commands us, ki gerim eitem be'artzo. You were foreigners in their land. You need to show them compassion. Unlike the nations of Moab and Ammon, where we're not allowed to marry ever, when it comes to the Egyptians, third generation is fine. They want to be part of Am Yisrael, no problem. So the approach towards Egypt and the Egyptians is not that this is the kingdom of evil. It's a little bit more complex. Sometimes, and if you think that this is the way the Torah is, then you're wrong. Because the Torah does single out certain nations, for example, like Sodom or Amalek, as the pure evil. Sodom had to be destroyed. There's no fixing Sodom. They're filled with corruption. It's beyond repair. There's no fixing here. They need to be destroyed. What about Amalek? We have a commandment to obliterate Amalek every generation. You read it every year before Purim. So the Torah does recognize evil, pure evil, Amalek, Sodom, but not Egypt. Egypt is, yeah, they're being punished, they're bad, but they're not pure evil or bad altogether. It's not 100%. Somebody wants to convert Egyptian, okay, no problem. We cannot hate them. You were a foreigner in the country. It's a little bit more complex. Let's go back. But in order to understand that beginning of the slavery in Egypt, where we started, we need to go to, not to Sefer Shmot, but a little bit backward to Sefer Bereshit. The slavery in Egypt doesn't happen when Bnei Israel paru, vayirbu, vayishretzu, vayarbu b'mod meod. It's not the beginning of Sefer Shmot when Bnei Israel multiply, v'timalei haaretz otam, when they fill the land, but rather, and remember what happens. Paro says, "Pen tikrena milchama v'nosaf gamu al sonenu v'nilcham banu v'ala min haaretz." Paro says, "There's so many of them, and if we're going to have war with them, they're going to win. They're going to kick us out. They're going to," right? It starts before that. It goes back to Sefer Bereshit. What happens in Sefer Bereshit? There's famine. Everybody in the region have nothing to eat. Mitzrayim, in Egypt, there's food. Why there's food? Joseph, right? Remember Joseph? He stored food for 7 years. They have big fridge, huge pantry. They have food for the whole region. Exactly. Now, at that time, what happens? The Egyptians, when the famine starts, the Egyptians come to Yosef and said, "We have nothing to eat." So, "Hinenu lecha la'avadim, kne otanu v'et," buy us as slaves. And the Torah says, "Vayikin bayom ha'u." And Yosef indeed buys the Egyptians as, call it slaves, call it whatever, workers, whatever you want to call it. He buys them. So they're going to be working now for Pharaoh. And in return, they get food. Who brings the idea? Who initiates that? No. The slaves, like the Egyptians, they come to Yosef and they say, "We have nothing to eat. We don't want to die. Take us as slaves, so at least we're going to live." And Yosef, the only person in the Bible that is called Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous, Yosef, who is righteous, what does he do? Without understanding even, he accepts their offer. Not only that, they accept the offer. They say to him, Hecheyitanu. You give us life. Because of you, we're alive. They're thankful. So the Egyptian people accept this idea of slavery because they have no choice. Nobody wants to be a slave, but under certain circumstances, when the other option is dying of hunger, a person agrees to become a slave. And Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous person in the Bible, the one that feeds the entire region, he becomes, without, I guess, intentions, a master of slaves. Guess what? In the next generation, it's not the Egyptians that are slaves. It's his brothers. It's the Jewish people. It's the Israelites are going to be slaves. Joseph's own descendants are going to be slaves. So the slavery in Egypt doesn't start. That not only starts with the agreement of the slaves, but according to their wish, according to their desire. They ask for it. Yes.
That Egyptians are no longer slaves and the Jews become slaves. We know how, where, when, why, none.
Nope. But they had, depends on what's Mefarish you look at that. 200 years, 400 years, depends how you look at that, to work it out somehow. At some point, the famine was over, and I guess they reached some sort of a deal that people got their land back, the Egyptians. I don't know. Who knows? Doesn't matter. But for our purposes, we always think that, how do you say, the Meshabed, the owner of the slaves, the slave master, thank you, he is the bad guy, right? Think about, like, American history. Think about what's happening in Africa. Think about, like, other places, right? The slave master, he's the bad guy. And the slaves, he's the good guy. He just wants freedom. He just want to be out. He just want to be free. But guess what? That's not the case. So we saw the one part of it about the slave master could be a righteous person, could be Yosef HaTzadik himself, that find himself in that situation that all of a sudden he's a slave master. What about the slaves from the other perspective? So Moshe is sent to take out those slaves. You would think the slaves want to be out. All they want is freedom. Right? But God says to him, Ata tireh, ki beyad chazaka yeshalchem. Now you'll see, God says to Moshe, that with strong hand, Paro is going to send them, the slaves, the Israelites, ubeyad chazaka yegarshem me'arzo. And with strong hand, he's going to deport them, kick them out. Rashi asks on the spot, he said, what does it mean, beyad chazaka yegarshem? What do you mean you need to kick them out of the land? The slaves wants to be free. Just give the slave the opportunity and they run for their lives, right? Why do you need to kick them out? Kicking somebody out, it means that that person doesn't want to leave. That's the implication. You don't kick somebody out, somebody who is dying to get out. And Rashi answers, Al korcham shel Yisrael yegarshem. Pharaoh will have to deport them, kick them out of Egypt against their will. The slaves here, the Israelites, are not really interested in leaving, even though they're slaves, even though things are bad. Slaves, many times, not only agree, but beg to stay a slave. Why? Because it depends on the circumstances. The Israelites, Bnei Israel, do not believe at that point alternative to the slavery. And therefore, somebody needs to kick them out. They don't see it. For hundreds of years, it's part of their DNA, it's part of their mentality. They don't know something else. They don't know better. So when the opportunity comes, they don't take it. They stay. Somebody needs to kick them out. In Parashat Kitavo, the Torah describes what's going to happen if we don't listen to God. One of the things, one of those punishments that the Torah describes is return to Egypt. Ve'shivcha. God says, I'm going to return, I'm going to take you back to Mitzrayim. And here is the interesting word. Ve'hitmakartem sham le'oivecha. Hitmakartem. That's the word. Now, what's the root word? Mem kafres, mechira, machar. Sell. It means you're going to be sold to slaves. Makes sense. The Ibn Ezra has a brilliant Perush on that. The Ibn Ezra, who was very language, says the following. Binyan yitpa'el. Okay, so in Hebrew we have different forms to the verb. This is more a reflexive verb. Atem tevakshu limkor et atzmechem. You, the slaves, you yourself, the Israelites, the Jews, you're going to ask to be sold as a slave. It's not that somebody's going to do that to you. You're going to ask to be sold. Like when I say in Hebrew, lehit labesh, that's the same form. Right? Lehit labesh is to get dressed. It's the same binyan. It's the same form. Right? Lehit rachetz is to wash myself. Lehit labesh is to dress myself. Lehit labet, to have dilemmas with myself. Right? So lehit maker is to sell yourself. So sometimes slavery starts with the slave. And the mistake that the slave master does, which we always think the slave master is the bad guy, is that they confuse that desire with consent. It seems that is a desire. That's what he wants. He wants to be sold as a slave. I'm doing them a favor. Without me, they have no food. Without me, they have no future. Without me, they have nothing. They ask to be slave. I'm just doing them a favor. I'm actually helping them. Same idea goes for, the Torah brings it when it comes to Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave. We can have like a whole class about, is the Torah really against slavery or not? That's a whole class. I'm gonna try to say it in one word. It's complex. In Parashat Mishpatim, when the Torah discusses the laws of Eved Ivri, Hebrew slave, the slave, right? The Torah says, "Ve'im lo yoveh ha'eved." The Eved, the slave, doesn't want to go. It's the time of the Shemitah. You know, Hebrew slave goes out when it's the Shemitah after 7 years, or the Jubilee, 50th year. But the Torah also describes a scenario in which the Eved, the slave, doesn't want to go. So there's a process. You take him to by the door, and they puncture his ear, basically gets like kind of an earring, and he becomes Eved Olam, a slave permanently, forever.
Even after Yovel? Even after Yovel?
Yes. Question is, why? Why would somebody do that? Why somebody becomes an Eved? Let's go back for a second. Eved Ivri. So somebody did something wrong. Somebody stole. Okay, you stole property from me. Or you broke my something, or you killed my ox, whatever that is. Some sort of a damage. The Torah says if you are unable to pay back, then what do? Is you become a slave for that person. You know, we see the logic. You can't pay back. So the worth of the work that you're going to do during that time is, instead of a payment for the damage. Okay, you killed my ox worth $10,000. You can't pay me. You're going to work for me for 6 months. That's the equivalent of $10,000. Okay. This is how it works, generally speaking. Okay. The Torah doesn't believe in prison. Because what's the point? I'm not getting paid for the damage. And you are not gaining anything that will help you to be a contributor to society. So instead of that, what are you going to do? You come and you live under my roof. I need to take care of, yes, you're going to work for me, but I'm going to take care of you. It's a process of rehabilitation. You're going to be set up with a nice Jewish family. You're going to learn about values. And hopefully, and when you go out also, I need to give you some sort of a financial foundation that you'll be able to get on your own. You're not going to be forced to go and steal or whatever. That's, in a nutshell, the system. So, the Eved Ivri, comes the time, it's the Shemitah year, or whatever that is, supposed to go. Here's your check. Good luck. Start a new life. The guy says no. Ahavti et Adoni, et ishti ve'et banai lo etzel hachofshi. I love my master. I love my family. I have family here. I don't want to go. That's the answer. Why doesn't he want to go? Why doesn't he want to go? I have a wife and kids here. I don't hate my master enough to give up my family. So under these circumstances, I don't want to be a slave, but under these circumstances, I agree. There's a consent. Shoshana, just give me a sec. To give up freedom, because freedom means giving up my family. And I love my wife and I love my kids and I don't want to give them up. So I'm going to give up my freedom.
Unless he has a foreign wife, not a Jewish wife. It's also,
The master, the slave master, is not a wicked guy. He's not a bad guy. He was trying to help the guy. But under these circumstances, he becomes what we perceived as the bad guy. He's got a slave forever. Now,
why don't you see that as a prohibition to take a foreign wife?
we'll talk about it. I'm happy to discuss it, but not today. Okay, Shoshana? In Sefer Vayikra kind of explains what I was alluding to earlier. What causes a person to become an Eved, a slave? The Torah says, Ki yamuch achicha. Ki yamuch achicha. That person lost all his money. And therefore, he is forced to steal. He has no bread. He has no food. He needs to survive. Under these circumstances, he becomes somebody's slave. Sefer Dvarim, the Torah says, as I mentioned, you need to give him a financial foundation. Ha'anek ta'aniklo, you're going to give him gift, financial gift. Otherwise, what's going to happen? If you're not going to do that, he's going to come back into slavery. So what are we achieving here? Nothing. So people sometimes, under certain conditions, under certain circumstances, agree, have that consent to become a slave. Bnei Israel agreed, just like the Egyptians, to be slaves. And when was a time of crisis in the desert, what did Bnei Israel say? Let's go back to Egypt. Nitna rosh v'nashuva mitzrayma. Let's go, just a sec. Let's go back to Egypt. The continuation of the verse. Ki tov lanu avodet Mitzrayim mimutenu bamidbar. We prefer to work, to be slaves for Egypt than dying here in the desert. If these are the two alternatives, I prefer to be a slave. I don't want to be dead. So that image that we have in our mind of a bird in a cage that just like dying to get out is not always accurate. And the Torah tells us that evil or bad things, like slavery is a bad thing, starts with a consent. If we really want to create a tikkun in the world, we need to understand that point where people confuse that consent with real desire. Fast forward from the Torah to a shoot. Shoot is a type of liturgy in Jewish history. It's called Shelot or Tshuvot. Now we're in the Middle Ages, Spain. The Rivash was one of the prominent rabbis at that time, was asked a question, fascinating case, and it's documented in his book. Two people had a contract, a loan contract, that said, if the borrower is not going to pay on time, then he becomes the lender's slave. Okay? Agreement. They both sign it, stamp, you name it, whatever you want. Kosher agreement. Nobody disputes the validity of that agreement. Guess what? He was not able to pay on time. Okay? And the lender wanted to, okay, We have an agreement. You have to be my slave now. Whatever that means, slave, butler, whatever, I don't know, whatever. And the question came before the Rivash to give a psak. Can they force the agreement? What do you think? By the way, nobody denies that, like, both agree that they signed the agreement when they're fully aware of it and the implications, and they agreed to the terms of the agreement and all that kind of stuff. I beg to differ, but so what do you think the Rivash ruled? Okay. Any other? You're gonna work for me. You work for me. Okay. Forget about like being a slave. Being a slave is work for me. Well, this is being a slave. The language here is very clear.
Is there another alternative pay off for a period of time?
That's not the question. That's not the question. We're not trying to find solutions here. The agreement said, if you're not going to pay me on time, you become my slave. It's a Jewish concept. Torah talks about slaves all the time. It's not something that is foreign to the Torah. I want to execute that agreement. We both agreed that we signed that. And the question came to the Rivaz, and the Rivaz says, absolutely no. It's not valid. Here's the quote from the Rivash. Adam eino yachol leshabed et atzmo. A person cannot slave himself. I don't know if I can use this as a verb. Enslave himself. Thank you. Im hitna al atzmo sheitfos hamalve et gufo vechatam lo al shtar eino mo'il ve'eino yachol le'osro ve'eino yachol lishtabed bo. Even though there's an agreement, and the agreement says that the lender becomes the owner of the borrower, and the borrower signed it, eino mo'il, it's not valid. You cannot execute it, and you cannot use it to force the person to become a slave. Not, end of quote. Not everything that I agree to is legitimate. That is the bottom line here. I can agree to something. I can agree to become a slave. It's not legitimate. Harav Shagar lived in Israel, passed away about 20 years ago. Have an essay on freedom. And he writes the following. האדם יכול לבחור בטוב או ברע. Man can choose between good and bad. אך אינו יכול לבחור מה טוב ומה רע. But we don't have the ability to choose what is good and what is bad. In our mind, many, many times, if somebody chooses, if I choose A, it means that's what's good for me, right? In our society, in our Western thinking, if I choose to wear a blue shirt today, it means that that's what I like. That's what's good for me. If I choose to, I don't know, eat something or not to eat something, or to do something or not to do something, it's because I am doing what is good for me. We can debate what is good and what is bad, and this doctor is kind of say, listen, this is not good, and the doctor say no, and no. Especially if you live in California, you have different opinions about what is good and what is bad. However, point is, our assumption is that if I make a choice about A, it means that that's good for me. Or at least I think that this is good for me. Torah says, Remember the slavery in Egypt? It was done by good people, regular people, righteous people. Bad things sometimes start from righteousness, or at least what we think is righteousness, or compassion.
There's no evidence that you willfully became slaves.
No, I didn't say that. The Egyptians.
No evidence.
How that happened, though?
They were weak.
I'm sorry, what? They were weak, and therefore what?
Worried.
Why they were weak? It says actually, they were multiplied. Why were they weak? And actually, not on. But it's not only that. Pharaoh said they're definitely not a minority anymore. They're multiplied. He said, they're gonna. Correct. And in that, the way they multiply, they're gonna be more than us. Yes. Okay. And people think that we're powerful, even not always we are. Okay, but what? Okay, so where are we going with that, though?
Our corrupt.
Okay.
It's complicated. It's service for the community, and then later it goes up to the slaves.
My feeling is the following. At the beginning was the Egyptians. But later on, generation 2, 3, whatever, Bnei Israel were there for hundreds of years. At some point, you want to be like everybody else. So if everybody has to have some sort of a deal with the government, you want to be, it becomes either by force or by desire. The end result is that they become slaves. The Jews become slaves. That's the way Sefer Shmot opens up. We have a gap between Sefer Bereshit and Sefer Shmot. We don't know what happened in the middle, but we do know where we stopped, that we're not slaves. We do know where we start again, that they are slaves. No, but they were already slaves when that king came to power. He just made things worse. Yeah, look at the Tanakh. But they were already slaves. Okay.
They did learn the trade.
Of course, this is why every Jew that goes and buys something in IKEA, then they need a handyman to come and put it together for them later. Okay. But so sometimes bad things, we said, start from good intentions. However, the morality or the conscience ask, what is moral? What is right? I'll take it another step. What does God want from me? Not what the man in front of me is asking me, but rather, what is it that God wants from me? That is the question that we need to ask ourselves. In this modern society that we live in, we, and definitely psychology, have a lot to say here, that we try to help people by helping them to find their real desire. What do you really want, right? That's what like psychologists will tell you. And in essence, what's behind that is the fact that people, under certain circumstances, during difficult times, might agree to anything. They might agree to become a slave. They might agree to take an underpaid position. They will agree to physical pain. They will agree to prostitution. We need to ask ourselves not that question, but rather, what is that person really wants? Not what they're saying to me now. What do they really want? And that goes hand in hand with the question of what does God want from me? Consent is not everything. A person agreed to something, it doesn't mean that they want it. We need to ask ourselves if under different circumstances, when things are balanced, when there's no sword or knife like attached to their throat or whatever, if they have money in the bank or whatever that is, the circumstances are, would they answer differently? This is what we need to aspire for. When somebody comes to you and they said they need a job, I don't know, cleaning, nanny, whatever, especially here in California, we have a lot of people, illegal immigrants, right? And they come and they're sometimes they're willing to work for pennies. And you think that sometimes you think, wow, I made a great deal. She's going to take only $5 an hour.
Then you're not a good person.
But you think that you help her because if you're not going to pay her that, she'll have nothing. She's going to die of hunger. She has nowhere to sleep. She's going to be in the streets. She's going to get into prostitution. She's going to do all horrible things. I'm going to give her a place to live. I'm giving her something. But that's not so she might agree to do that because she has no choice. But that's not the question. The real question that we need to ask ourselves. Under different circumstances, would she agree to work on those conditions? And if the answer is no, then you have your answer. God wants more from us.
What about Allah being able to, I don't know how to translate it.
Well, it's the same idea.
What?
This is the same idea.
Allah
Because you say, well, without that,
it could be more.
it's going to be worse. I said, that's not enough.
Sure.
No. You need to take the next step. See, the fact that we're even having this discussion, it shows you we are all good people. Nobody here is evil. But under certain circumstances, we find ourselves doing things that are morally wrong. And if we understand that mechanism and we can identify them, then we can perhaps minimize that stuff in this world. Thank you. Next week, a different mechanism and a different